Chapter 13. A Harpy at the Circus. Reyes and Jenni found the Harpy in a small enclosure between the griffin and manticore cages. The only thing separating the creature from the gathered crowds was a low wooden wall that came up to about the Harpy's waist. Positioned about a foot out from that low wall, at ankle height, was a white painted wire. Posted on the wall of the enclosure was a notice for those who could read. For your own safety, approach no closer than the wire. It couldn't really be said that the creature in the enclosure was the most prime example of a harpy. For a start, her wings had been cut off, no doubt to stop her escaping the circus and terrorizing the local neighborhood. She was getting on in years. She had to be in her 20s at the least. On her wrists she wore a pair of silver bracelets that to Reyes glowed with a distinctive blue light that he had come to know as an indication of magic. The harpy was dressed only in a black leather skirt of harpy manufacture, and nothing else. Although Reyes knew that Greyfulf had a few of these skirts as trophies, skirts that he had taken in battle, Reyes had never really had the opportunity to see one close up. This particular skirt had 6 long narrow pockets, 3 on either side, that made Reyes wonder what they were for. Reyes didn't mention it to Jenni. He didn't want her thinking that he was perverted. But he would have to admit to himself that he was disappointed that she was wearing a skirt at all. Reyes had heard that harpies often went naked, and he had hoped to get a good look at her tail, and maybe even other parts of her body as well. Reyes was in no doubt as to why she was wearing the skirt. It wasn't because the harpy would get embarrassed about the idea of being naked in front of so many people. It was hard to embarrass a harpy. No, she was wearing the skirt in order to address concerns of human decency. The harpy in the enclosure might not be the prettiest in the world, but Reyes, who had never seen a real harpy in the flesh before, couldn't take his eyes off her. She's beautiful. There were some murmurs of dissent from some of the crowd who had heard him. Some even seemed to be quite scandalized at the merest idea that a harpy could be considered anything but ugly. The harpy, armed with the traditional short bow of her race, fired an arrow into a wooden bucket at the far end of the enclosure. The strength that she put into the shot proved to be enough for the arrow to penetrate the bucket and hit an archery target that had been positioned behind it. Her arrow struck the central bullseye. She then turned and faced Reyes with what for a harpy approached a smile. "Why, thank you." Reyes felt the blood fill his cheeks. She had heard him. He felt embarrassed. Part of him was also horrified. What was it about harpies that he found so alluring? He knew many girls about the castle, and none of them got his blood flowing like one small comment of gratitude from a harpy, and a maimed harpy at that. And that voice. It was so feminine. Reyes had expected, well, he didn't know what he had expected, but it wasn't that. Her voice was feminine, even by human standards. Admittedly, there was an edge to her voice, maybe an accent, although Reyes assumed it was because she was speaking a human language with a non-human mouth. Jenni, standing nearby, seemed slightly amused by the exchange. Then a sudden thought seemed to strike her, and with a touch of surprise in her voice, she said to the harpy, "You speak Flourish?" The harpy simply gave her a dirty look as if to suggest that, since she had spoken in Flourish, it was a stupid question. Then she turned her back on Jenni and walked slowly halfway down the course, where she placed a heavy metal shield on a rack positioned in such a way that it would obscure her view of the target even more than the bucket already did. Amid cries of alarm from the crowd, Reyes stepped carefully over the wire and rested his arms lightly on top of the wall. He simply couldn't see how a creature as beautiful as this harpy could possibly be considered so dangerous. "You shouldn't do that," someone in the crowd shouted. "Be careful," Jenni warned. "She might look harmless, but I'm sure that bow could kill." The harpy walked gently over to Reyes and patted him reassuringly on the head, caressing him gently and causing shivers to run along his spine. The harpy seemed surprised. "Most who step over the wire recoil from my attempt to touch them. I welcome your attention." Reyes smiled at her. He had feelings for this harpy that he had never felt for any of the human girls that frequented the castle grounds. He couldn't help thinking that he would be horrified at himself later, but right now he intended to enjoy her proximity. Comments of alarm continued to be uttered by various members of the crowd. Comments such as, "Get away from there," and "She might turn on you at any moment." Slowly, the Harpy stepped away from Reyes. "Don't be so concerned," she told them. She placed the bow down so that it was resting against the wooden wall. "He is quite safe where he is." And then she turned so that she could address the crowd more directly. As she spoke, she raised her hands in order to display her silver bracelets. "I would seriously love to kill each and every one of you. You are all safe, though. These things prevent me from intentionally doing harm to anyone." There was another murmur of alarm among those in the crowd as the Harpy quickly grabbed her bow again, nocked an arrow, and aimed it towards the crowd. She then spun around quickly, releasing the arrow without even seeming to aim. The arrow flew directly on target, smashing through the heavy metal shield as if it was no more than paper. The arrow then lodged in the bucket. If it had gone through, it would have been on a perfect line to hit the bullseye again. The Harpy scratched her head a little disappointedly. Then she knocked another arrow and fell to the floor, hitting it in a way that would have been impossible if she had still had her wings. She fired her bow straight upwards this time. The arrow arched gently over the top of the shield and hit the previous arrow, splitting it lengthways and causing the bucket to keel over and topple out of the way. Before the second arrow had even landed, she was on her feet and had fired again. This second arrow went straight through the hole that was already in the heavy shield and smashed into the fletching of the arrow she had fired at the very beginning of the display. This time she missed the bullseye, but only because the grain of wood in the first arrow prevented a clean split. Some people in the crowd left muttering that the entire display was a con. Someone was heard to say, "No one can shoot like that unless magic was involved." Reyes felt he knew better. After all, he would have seen the glow of magic come off the arrows had they been somehow enchanted. He commented admiringly, "As good as I get. I'll never be able to shoot like that." The Harpy flashed Reyes another smile and told him, "Well, maybe I don't want to kill all of you." Then she seemed to notice the bow he was carrying. "You're very young. Can you actually use that bow you carry? Show me." Reyes seemed to show no fear as he climbed over the wall and entered the enclosure. He knew he should be scared of the Harpy, and yet his fascination with her was such that he couldn't get close enough. "Don't!" Jenni called. She held her breath for a moment. Jenni wasn't the only one who was scared for the young boy. A number of people in the crowd made a variety of concerned exclamations. Near the back of the crowd, someone asked, "Is this part of the act?" The Harpy removed the shield that was still blocking the target. "I don't expect you'll have the strength to penetrate that. I'll be surprised if you can even pull back the string on your bow." Reyes prepared his bow for use. Then he took aim at the target and held his breath for the way Agnart had taught him. The Harpy stood next to him, clearly impressed that Reyes was indeed able to draw back the string on such a bow. "Take your time." Reyes released the arrow. With the Harpy so close to him doing strange things to his emotions, it was quite possibly the worst shot he had ever fired. The arrow hit the wooden boards just behind the target and buried itself deep. "I am impressed," the Harpy said. "How long have you been human?" What?" Reyes asked, shocked. Jenni's utterance was one of extreme concern. "Pah!" someone in the crowd commented. "That's a fake bow." "I'm kidding," the Harpy said. "There are not many fully grown humans that can use one of our bows, and you're what, 9 or 10? "No, I'm only Reyes started to say. "Reyes," Jenni shouted, interrupting him. She looked worriedly around at the crowd. The Harpy looked at Jenni. She tilted her head to the side, a glint in her eye, a sudden understanding perhaps. Then she turned back to Reyes and said, "I see. Well, don't worry, your secret is safe with me." "Secret?" Reyes said, looking at the Harpy accusingly. "What secret? Why does everyone keep going on about secrets?" There was a surprised look on the Harpy's face, as if she had suddenly struck a raw nerve she hadn't even known was there. "I don't know anything about any secret. I was just kidding with you. I'm sure your friend, if she does keep any secrets from you, is keeping them because she only has your best interests at heart." Then she paused. I assume she is your friend." "My sister," Reyes replied. "You're sure you don't know the secret?" "How would I know?" the Harpy replied. "You and I have barely met. I'll admit I do have my suspicions. You see, we live in a world of magic. Please, Jenni pleaded. The Harpy looked at Jenni and nodded. I doubt I'm right. I'll tell you what. Come back and visit me next time the circus is in your area. Then maybe, if your sister is agreeable, I will tell you what I suspect. Why can't you tell me now? Reyes urged. Jenni was fidgeting a lot. She was looking worriedly about the crowd. Your sister isn't ready, the Harpy replied. There was more murmuring from the gathered crowd. Why wasn't the Harpy getting on with the exhibition? A lot of people had already begun to move on to the other wonders. Go, for now, the Harpy said. But remember me. Reyes closed his eyes. He had seen a magician produce a bunch of flowers out of thin air just that morning. It wasn't an easy thing to do, to reproduce a spell he had only seen done once, but he was willing to give it a try. A moment later he held a single dandelion in his hand. Not the most romantic of flowers, but better than nothing. He handed the flower to the Harpy. For you. No one has ever given me flowers before, she commented happily. Then a realization seemed to come to her. You used magic, didn't you? For a moment she seemed a little crestfallen. I guess I was mistaken after all then. I thought that maybe you were... No, it seems I was wrong. No, you're not wrong, Jenni whispered, more to herself than anything. The Harpy suddenly looked up at Jenni. She had heard. Then she looked back at Reyes, tilted her head to one side again, and said, Interesting. You've given me a lot to think about. See you in a few years. Reyes climbed back over the fence to the correct side of the enclosure, and then he looked back at the Harpy and asked, What's your name? I was born Agnart, but around here they just call me Harpy, she said. We should go, Jenni pressed, worried that Reyes might learn something he shouldn't from the Harpy. I'd like to see something else of this circus. Besides, we should try and find Anita and Sagrant. They'll find us here, Reyes commented. I'm sure they'll be along sooner or later. Please, Reyes, Jenni pleaded. Reyes looked sharply round at his sister and insisted, I want to stay here. Why don't you go and find them? You can meet me back here later. Jenni sighed. Please, I promised our father I'd keep an eye on you while we were here. Now, it was a long journey to get here, and I'd like to see something of the rest of the circus before we go home. It was good to visit the Harpy, but I don't feel quite the same way about her as you do. Please, Reyes, don't ruin the day for me. Reyes nodded. He sighed loudly and looked longingly at the Harpy. I'm not going anywhere if you want to come back later, Agnart told him. I think I'm in love, Reyes joked wistfully. He may have been more serious than even he realized. Don't be silly, Jenni replied. Come on, let's go. Reyes sighed. He waved to his new friend, but she was already looking the other way and setting up some new obstacles through which to shoot. For all the wonders the circus had to offer him, for the rest of the day, Reyes could think only of one thing. Agnart. Jenni and Reyes found Sagrant and his daughter over by another sideshow. A muscle-bound man was picking up heavy weights and moving them about the stage as if they were as light as a feather. Reyes was impressed, but he didn't care that much. His mind insisted on wandering. He wanted to go back to the Harpy enclosure. He would happily spend the rest of the day just watching her and her skill with a bow. That night at the inn, the realization of his infatuation began to make him feel guilty. He loved her, but she was a Harpy. How could he have these feelings for her? He tried to control his feelings for her, make them more about her skill with a bow rather than her beauty. It didn't take. In his imagination he could see only her face. The trip back to the castle was as uneventful as the trip to the circus had been. They did pass a patrol at one point, but that was about it. Once back at the castle, Reyes stabled his horse as quickly as he could, and then hovered impatiently nearby, trying to will his sister to move a little faster. He really wanted her to come with him, and though she took no longer than normal to dismount and hand her pony over to the castle stable hands, it seemed to Reyes that she was taking forever. It didn't help that once she had also dismounted, Anita came over and started to chat with Jenni. In the end, Reyes decided he could wait no longer. He had to go and see his father. Reyes found the Duke alone in the study, working. He was never sure what his father was working on because always, before he entered, he would knock politely on the wooden door and wait to be invited in. On this occasion, there was the distinctive sound of rustling papers and a desk drawer closing. Then his father's voice called, "Come in." Reyes opened the door and entered. "Ah, Reyes," the Duke said, looking up from what he was doing. "Do take a seat. How did you find the circus?" "It was fun, Father. I want to go back," Reyes replied. He sat down in the Duke's guest chair, feeling a little uncomfortable because of its size. "That's good to hear," the Duke commented. "Father," Reyes said. "Yes, son?" "I met a girl at the circus." Reyes walked his words tentatively around what he wanted to say. "Oh yes," the Duke was suddenly very animated. He crossed his fingers on the desktop and leaned a little closer. "Tell me more." "She was beautiful, Father. The greatest shot I've ever seen with a bow." "She was one of the sideshows then," the Duke suggested. "She was, Father," Reyes admitted, his eyes suddenly downcast. I was thinking..." He hesitated. "Yes, son?" the Duke pressed. "I was thinking that maybe we could buy her from the circus, and she could teach me her skill with the bow. I mean, Sir Grant is a good teacher, but you should have seen this girl, Father." "Buy her from the circus?" the Duke said. "Don't you mean hire her? There's some part to this you aren't telling me, isn't there, son?" Reyes sighed, and his head drooped a little. "She's a harpy, Father." Then quickly he said, "I'm sorry, Father. I don't know what's wrong with me these days. How can I be in love with a harpy?" "I see," the Duke said with a sly grin. "I should have guessed." "I'm afraid I can't allow her to enter the castle, son. You see, she's safe at the circus. While she's there, she's protected by the crown. If she were to leave the circus for whatever reason, she would be considered a criminal, and I'd be forced to put her to death. You understand?" "I do, Father," Reyes said despondently. "I'm sorry," the Duke said sensitively, "but I couldn't allow it." "I understand, Father," Reyes said sadly. "Perhaps it's better that way."